This is another list that I like and I find interesting and I also think is incomplete. But we'll stick to this. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it. It's good. Um, professional behavior, and we're gonna really define professional behavior in medical legal. We're going to talk more about because there are certain things that differentiate a professional from a non-professional. Professions have rules. Professions, most of them have to do with conduct. I'll go ahead and tell you that. But they have rules. They have ethical codes, legal codes that are specific to a profession. Um, Integrity. I'm going to tell you now, your word is all you have. 90% of what you're going to do as an EMT, nobody's going to see it except perhaps your partner. There's not going to be a supervisor standing over your shoulder. They're going to review the call after the fact. I can tell you from being someone who has supervised paramedics that the relationship between me and them was based on integrity. I had to believe what they told me, that it was true. I would go to the wall for them if I believed it. And subsequently or consequently, when I caught someone lying to me, that relationship was irreparably damaged. Because I can't supervise them directly, I have to believe that what they told me, what they say is true, is true. If I find out that they've lied to me, then we don't have a basis for working together anymore. We don't. I can't trust them to go out into the public and do what they're supposed to do, which I have to be able to trust them to do. So integrity is extremely important. I would much rather, if you screw up, say, Rob, I screwed up. See, I can fix that. I can work with that. It's true that most of the mistakes made in the field are not fatal ones, thank God. They're not mistakes that really hurt somebody. When a medic makes a mistake, we're all human. I told you that our benchmark is perfection. That's what we're shooting for every single time. But I'd be a fool to think we're always going to get it. So if you make a mistake and you admit to it, I look upon that as a teachable moment. Assuming that I don't have to go to court and assuming I don't have to, it's not splashed all over the newspapers, but you make a simple mistake. And let's be clear, not apathy, a mistake. We have a bad habit in this world today of linking the two and calling them all the same thing. Let me explain the difference. If I ask you what 2 and 2 is, and you sit down and you get your pencil out and you do some math and you think real hard and you come up with 5, okay, that's a mistake. I can work with that. If I ask you what 2 and 2 is and you say, who gives a damn, it's a stupid question, that's not a mistake. That's apathy. And they're not the same thing. But if you make a mistake and tell me about it, we can usually work around it. It's a teachable moment. We learn from it. We don't, and you may identify a systemic problem. The mistake you made may have been based on bad instructions from management. I'm thinking like management now. Maybe something that we changed or put out there was not clear. You actually help us clear up some misconceptions, but it's usually a teachable moment. If you lie to me, now it's moved over into the content of your character, and you have to be trusted to be a paramedic. At least if you work for me, I have to trust you. Empathy. We don't show this often. We tend to develop very dark, twisted senses of humor. But the only people that I ever know have lost empathy were completely fried. They were people that either made a really bad career choice in getting into this business, or B, they were fried. They were emotionally spent. They just didn't have it in them anymore to have empathy for anybody. You could argue it's a defense mechanism. Maybe it is. But even the toughest medics I've ever seen that were just, badasses, they had empathy. You could tell, if you knew them well enough, you could tell in the way they interacted with people, they had empathy. They were tough and they were, hard as a rock, but I've seen them do things, go out of their way to do things based on empathy, on feeling bad for this other person, or being able to feel, at least sympathize with what they're feeling. If you don't have empathy, this is not the profession. Man, I can't think of a place in medicine for you if you don't have that. I just can't. Self motivation. This is a big one. As I said earlier, a lot of what you do, you're going to do in the dark. I'm not going to see it. I'm going to read about it. If you really screw up, somebody's going to tell me about it. You have to be motivated. You have to be able to take charge of a situation, and you have to be able to keep control of yourself, for one thing, and you've got to be willing to go out and do the things that need to be done. Not really a profession for shrinking violence. It really isn't. You know, if you're a wallflower, I might not want to go into this particular arena unless you can overcome it, because you're going to be expected to lead, and you're going to be expected to take control and do what needs to be done. Professional appearance and hygiene. I'm blessed over my career. I haven't really had to deal with a lot of hygiene issues. I'm trying to think. I think I had a student once that had a little issue with that. Yes, I did. I had one employee. He was a part-time employee, and bless his heart, a lot of it, he worked at a pickle plant. Super good guy, just as nice as he could be. He's still a friend of mine. We don't communicate all that often since I returned home, but he's a sweet guy. But he smelled like pickles, and I got complaints about that, because what would happen was, he was a part-timer. He'd leave work and comes, get into a uniform, and it wasn't a big deal. I just had to tell him, look, you might want to shower before you come into work, because you smell like a pickle. Anyway, professional appearance, going to say a word about that. Look, guys, fashions change. People's idea of what's acceptable or appropriate or whatever change. Please keep in mind that medicine is still a very conservative profession. We happen to be the blue-collar arm of a very white-collar business, but it is still medicine. People have certain expectations out of medical professionals. I don't have a problem with, a lot of things that people do, but I am going to tell you, I'll tell you a story that may illustrate this. And this wasn't back in the 90s. This was in 2016. I had a very good student who dyed her hair blue. Now, as Rob did, I don't care what you want to do with your hair. It's all you, man. It's your world. Have at it. But when I went to get her ID, her student ID for a clinical setting, which happened to be Moses Cone, I don't think there's any harm in saying that, they told me very quickly she cannot do clinical hair with blue hair. Can't do it. So I had to go back and say, and she was a sweet girl, and I liked her a lot, smart girl too. And I went back and had to say, honey, you got to lose the blue hair. I can't get you into clinical like that. They will not allow it. All I'm going to say is medical professions are not generally places for fashion statements. They really aren't. If you have multiple piercings, hey, it's your thing. Go for it. But you're probably not going to be able to wear visible ones on the truck or in clinical. You're probably not. Not to mention the fact that there's some I don't want to say hygiene issues, but it's another pathway for a pathogen to get into your body. Lord knows you got enough. And a lot of them will not allow it on that basis. They will not allow visible nose rings, studs in the nose, 5,000 earrings, in your ear, 6-inch long fingernails. There's things they're not going to allow. This is not a place for a fashion statement. You also have to remember that our job is about people. It's not about us. And you walk into some of these old people's houses looking like that, you're going to scare them to death, rightly or wrongly. Maybe they shouldn't be, but they are. You have to be sensitive to a lot of things in this business. Doesn't mean you have to kowtow to all of them, but you do have to be sensitive to them. So professional appearance is extremely important. How you wear your uniform is extremely important. I have seen people get off of a truck at an accident scene and look like they'd been sleeping one off in an alley for about 3 days, and they were in uniform. That would have been better for them just to not wear the uniform, because they were complete slobs. And whether you like it or not, boys and girls, people will, at least initially, and sometimes forever, will judge you by the way you look. And that's our cross to bear. We need to look professional. Just keep in mind that this is not a place for a fashion statement. It really isn't. When in doubt, remind yourself it's not about you. It's about the patient. Self-confidence. Man, I could stop and move on, but I'm not going to. Tell you a quick story. When I was a baby medic last century, I watched the veterans. I was in awe of them. I really was. And it wasn't because they knew, I mean, they did know more than me just by virtue of experience, but as far as pure medical knowledge, I had just come out of school. I was state of the art. I could probably match them on test questions on anything. But when they went out on a scene and I would go with them, you had all this chaos going on. These veterans would walk up. They didn't yell, they didn't scream, they didn't shout, hey, everybody look at me, listen up. Didn't have to. When they got there, just by the way they carried themselves, people parted ways. They got out of their way, and all eyes were fixed on them. And the reason was, first of all, they had built a reputation as someone who is a solid person to have in a bad situation, which you need to be a paramedic. They didn't freak out. They didn't spin, as we say in the business. They were controlled. They were measured. They knew what they were doing. Everybody on that scene knew help is here. And they didn't do it by yelling and screaming and making smart-ass remarks. They didn't do that. It was just who they were. But back in the day, in that last century, they called it a commanding presence, and they had it. I call them the street lords because when they went out there, they were in command. They didn't have to tell anybody they were. A lot of, particularly younger medics and a lot of younger people, try to achieve this by being cocky. And trust me, boys and girls, I don't care how smart you are, you're not going to intimidate a veteran that way. As a matter of fact, you're going to annoy them. You know, there's a time, and you should be confident. There's a fine line between being confident and being cocky, and a lot of that line you can tell when you've crossed it in how you're interacting with other people. If you are so terrified that somebody's going to know something that you don't, it's going to show. And I'll leave it at that. This video is getting amazingly long. Effective time management. Well, you do have to be efficient. Sometimes your time management's out of your control. When I get stuck at a hospital because the hospital's busy and my truck and my services are needed back out in the street and I can't go anywhere because I still have a patient on my stretcher, that means my time management is not mine. There's nothing I can do about that. But all things being equal, when that's not happening, I need to be brief about my business. I need to go treat my patients. I need to be efficient about that. I need to get them to the hospital. I need to be efficient about that. I need to get back on the streets where I'm available. Good verbal and written communication skills. Today, notwithstanding, where my lips and tongue are not wanting to work together, you need to be relatively well spoken, or at least clear. You don't have to use. Matter of fact, I'd caution you, don't use a lot of big words and medical terms. People don't understand them, but you do need to be able to communicate with people. I think sometimes people come off as short that way too, when what they're doing really is just trying to make sure that they're understood. So they're direct. That may or may not be the case, but I think it is the case some of the time. Teamwork and diplomacy. Well, I know a lot of medics that, and I've probably been one at one time or another, that need to work on their diplomatic skills. People will tell you, and you don't know this, but I think if you ask people who know me, who've worked me, they would say Rob's very diplomatic. A good friend of mine, one of the instructors in this program, and someone I've worked with several, we used to joke about it. There were jobs he was good at, and there were jobs that I was good at. If it required diplomacy, you sent me. If it required a hammer, you sent him. And we laughed about it because we knew our strengths and would joke about them. So being diplomatic, you don't have to say everything that crosses your mind. You just don't. Grace, in the non-biblical term, grace, letting something pass once in a while. It's not going to kill you. It might make your life a lot simpler. You don't have to be combative with people. You don't have to. You can be diplomatic. As I said before, there are times when you must be direct. There's times when you must be blunt, to get through somebody's head what's going on. But that's not the first tool I pull out of the toolbox. Let's put it that way. Teamwork, if you don't learn, I mean, it's funny. We as paramedics are not really taught teamwork, at least in a large group like a fire department is. We're taught to work in very small groups, and we do well in very small groups, and sometimes we do well when we're on our own. But you have to face the fact that a large percentage of the calls you're going to run are not going to be single agency responses. There are going to be other people there, and you can make your life a lot easier or a lot harder by how you handle teamwork. Again, patient advocate. You need to do what's right for the patient, even if you don't like them. I'm tempted to tell a story, but I'm not going to. I've had patients that, quite frankly, I didn't like. I had a man who murdered 2 women in Danville, fled across the line to Rockingham County, and then shot himself, and I had to work on him. I didn't like him. Busted my ass, saved his life. That's my job. We were unsuccessful. Kind of happens when you put a 38 in your mouth and pull the trigger. But I didn't like the guy. It wasn't my job to like him. It was my job to treat him, and I did, to the best of my ability. Once you start making judgments on who deserves your care and who doesn't, you're on the fast track to the dark side. You really are. You're going to scar your soul. That's not our call. They need help, we give it. We'll let the courts figure it out or the Lord's justice figure it out, whatever, but it's not my job. I'm my patient's advocate, even if I don't like them. While I was editing this, I realized something. If you were listening closely, and I told you a little bit of a story, the story I wasn't going to tell about this gentleman, if you were listening closely, you would probably have a question as, how did I know what he did at the time I was working on him? This gentleman that I told you had killed 2 women. Just so you'll understand, and not have that question, the call came in as a shooting. I was riding with a brand new medic that I was helping to break in, and the law enforcement thought he was dead, and he certainly looked it, and he shot himself in the head. So it was a logical assumption for the habit. They're also treating it like a crime scene, and they didn't want both of us, me and my partner, there. So I went upstairs. He was in an upstairs room at a farmhouse, and they just wanted me to check him, say he's dead, and get the heck out of there, which is exactly what I would have done if he'd been dead. Turns out he wasn't dead. So I had to bring my team, which also included members of the rescue squads and fire departments had arrived by then, to run this attempted resuscitation. And the entire time I was doing it, the law enforcement officer out of Danville, who had come down to work with Rockingham County, North Carolina deputies on this case, was right at my shoulder telling me everything this guy did. And I didn't like him. It was horrible. And I'm not upset with the law enforcement officer. I understand what he was telling me. But again, he was my patient. He was my patient, and we had a job to do. On a lighter note, one other thing that happened on that call was my rookie partner he drove to the scene. I was in the attendant seat, and forgot to disconnect the shoreline. And now in some places you do that, you're going to rip it out of the wall. This one, it just came unplugged from another plug, and we responded emergency traffic to the other side of Rockingham County, dragging 40 feet of shoreline. So, and I was able to in a good-natured way, give my friend a hard time for many, many months to come. And if I see him, I still do. Anyway, I just thought I would explain that so you would understand where that came from. Now back to your regularly scheduled lecture. And careful delivery of service. You can't be slipshod in this business. You can't go around willy-nilly just kind of freelancing. You're going to get burned. You're going to kill somebody for one thing and carry that with you for the rest of your life. Or you're going to get really between a rock and a hard place, and you're going to wind up out of the profession and possibly broke. Good moral character. This is tough. It's tough to talk about without sounding preachy. Um, Suffice it to say, if you don't have good moral character, you will eventually run afoul of your own behavior sooner or later. Your life will be a lot easier if you have, well, morals. See, guys, morals are different from ethics. Morals are different from laws. Morals are the things that guide you, your basic sense of right and wrong. Your moral character. You know not to steal, whether anybody's looking or not. You know, well, I could go on and on. We'll talk more about morals when we get into medical legal, because we have to differentiate moral, legal, and ethical, and we'll talk about that in depth. Stability and adaptability. If you're not a stable person, I like to use the word steady. You've got to be steady, no matter what's coming at you. You've got to hold yourself in control. You have to do it. If you can't do that, you're not going to do well in this profession at all. Adaptability. You're either going to learn that or it's going to end you. Because there are going to be things that happen that the book didn't say this. The book didn't tell me how to handle this. You've got to adapt to it. You've got to apply your skill and your knowledge and adapt to the situation and still live up to that benchmark of doing it right. It's tall order. It really is. The ability to listen. Listening is a skill.
If you want to walk out of this place, you will listen to people who know. You be an individual, and I'll be tagging your ugly, toothless face straight on its way to a long box with metal handles.
It really is. Communication is a skill. It is probably one of the most misunderstood concepts. We think we're communicating, we're not. What we're saying and what someone's hearing, two different things, and vice versa. What they're saying and what I'm hearing, two different things. You have to listen carefully. You have to follow directions. That's very important. Resourcefulness. As I said, you've got to adapt, and this profession will throw a lot of weird things at you that aren't on any scenario list or not in any textbook. Your resourcefulness is how you manage those. You have to be able to think outside the box. You sometimes have to use things in a way they weren't specifically meant to use. Be careful with that, because if you injure a patient using something that wasn't supposed to be used for this, they're going to burn you down. Cooperative, and then you do have to be cooperative. You do have to be able to cooperate with each other. One of the reasons that I mentioned mass casualty incidents, one of the reasons that we tend to stumble on those is everybody wants to be in charge, and the reason is because we are taught to be leaders. We're not taught to be followers, and sometimes you have to follow. Too many. I have an old saying: the only thing worse than not having enough paramedics on the scene is having too doggone many. You can have too doggone many on there, and that's when things start to break down, because they're taught that they're the one responsible for resolving the situation. You got 8 of them out there all trying to be responsible for resolving the situation. No, there's a time when you cooperate and somebody else makes the call and you play along with them. And I'm not going to talk about maintenance of certificate or licensure, because I already did. It's your responsibility to do that. The requirements will be clear to you, and you have to make sure that you do it. And most services you're going to go to work for, if you attend their Con Ed, you don't have to worry about having enough hours for recert. They build that into their recertification programs, and if you do, but some people, and in some services it's mandatory, you will attend them, and others it's not. They put them out there, you can pick up on them or you don't. Now that we have talked about the characteristics, some of the characteristics of what makes an EMT, not all by any stretch of the imagination, we'll discuss more as we go forward. We're going to talk about how EMS systems are organized, and starting with the state EMS agency role. Every state has some EMS authority. In North Carolina, it's North Carolina Office of Emergency Medical Services. I know, not the most imaginative title, but very descriptive. And it has an interesting history the North Carolina Office of EMS, owing largely to its first chief. And I know most of you do not remember. If I mentioned the names Gage and DeSoto to you, you would have no idea what I'm talking about. But anybody who, let's say over the age of 40 anyway, will remember them or at least be familiar with them as the stars of a TV show called Emergency. And I don't think it's overstating things to say that television show really put the paramedic on the map. It was a big push forward for EMS in the United States when this show about two Los Angeles fire department paramedics, very, very good show. I watched it when I was a kid and I loved it back then. But North Carolina's connection with that show ran even deeper. There was a creative consultant, a firefighter named James O'Page, who consulted for that show. And when North Carolina was trying to set up its EMS system, they sent people out to recruit Chief Page to be the first head of the Office of EMS. Little North Carolina EMS trivia for you. Why is the title, we rarely use, in EMS we rarely use the title chief. That's a fire title. But the top job, the top position, the director, if you will, of NCOEMS, the title is chief, and that's the reason. James O'Page was a chief. He's the one that selected that title, and it has been chief ever since. Little North Carolina EMS trivia for you. Since I'm on the subject, ironically, despite the great work that James Page did, and afterward he was involved in a magazine called Gems, which is still one of the primary professional journals for EMS. There's a few more out there now, but he was on the editorial board and a frequent contributor to that. But James Page in North Carolina, James was ahead of his time. Chief Page was ahead of his time, and he ran afoul of a lot of the rural, particularly rural county elected officials when he insisted that candidates for EMT in North Carolina be literate. It's hard for us to imagine that today, but when he said one of the requirements for being an EMT, and this was his job to set up the requirements for being an EMT in North Carolina, one of those requirements is that you be able to read and write. And many, many public officials, particularly in rural areas, got really upset with that. And the state put a lot of pressure on him to drop that requirement. He refused to do it. So then they asked him to resign, and he refused to do that too. He said, I'm not going to resign. You can fire me, but I'm not going to resign. So the parting of the ways between the two wasn't that great. But in retrospect, the work he did and sticking to his guns was a great benefit to NCOEMS. A little trivia for you, give you some idea where you came from. Told you I wouldn't get into history because I have a tendency to get lost in it, so I will shut up now and we'll move on. Let's check back in with Ben. And when we last left Ben, if I recall, because it's been several days since I sat down to do this part of this, Ben, we'd had an ALS intercept, and Alexis apparently hopped on board with Peter, and they're continuing their treatment. Alexis is going to call in and report to the receiving hospital. Peter continues to reassure Ben and monitor his condition. Alexis begins the preliminary paperwork. So things are looking up right now for Ben. I mean, it's not a good day for him any way you look at it, but it could be a lot worse. This question kind of drifts off into another subject, which is medical legal. What is the legal basis for EMTs providing medical treatment to patients? How do we do that? You might be tricked and say, well, they're certified, but no. And you have no way of knowing this unless you went and read the regulations. The answer's there. But our legal basis, beyond our certification, is that we work under the supervision of a physician, a medical director. And we're going to talk more about the medical director later in this slideshow, but we have what's called a delegated practice. We are the eyes, ears, and hands of the physician, which, and a little spoiler alert, which gives a medical director a lot of authority in an EMS system. And I'll resist the urge to go into that right now. What mechanisms must be in place to ensure the care provided is the highest quality and conforms to the standard of the medical community? Well, I think this is great to stimulate discussion, but it also is a little bit early in our education to be talking about these things because we haven't talked about all of the things it takes to answer that question. The medical director, again, oversees directly or indirectly everything that goes on in that system. A lot of checks and balances in place, but you also have to look at regulations, training standards, all of which are set forth by NCOEMS. So that's where they're going with that. I'll get you to think about that, and you can probably think of some more. There's a lot of things that go into making sure the care provided is the highest quality. We could probably spend the next few hours discussing those in detail. Before I flip this slide, I was thinking about what I talked about in a little while back. I was talking about your education standards, and I didn't really mention. I said you'll know what they are and you're responsible for keeping them. If you're curious, the short answer to how much continuing education do I have to have for an EMT in the state of North Carolina, it's 80 hours, and it breaks down 80 hours from different. And that's 80 hours in 4 years. Your certification will run 4 years, so you got to pick up 80 hours of content in 4 years. I want to submit to you. And it's been a while since I checked this, but I have checked it before, but it's been a while, so I could be wrong now. I don't think I am. We, as paramedics, advanced EMTs, and EMTs, are required to do, in many cases, more continuing education than other medical disciplines. We are... it seems like every so often the hours go up. This is one reason why it's very difficult to maintain a volunteer agency beyond the level of EMT, and it's hard to do it at EMT level because there's so many requirements that you have to make that system work, and it's just hard to get people who are volunteers to make that kind of time commitment. There are still some out there that'll do it. God bless them. But 80 hours over 4 years, the topics have to fall into different categories. I'm not going to go into. I'm looking at them as I sit here at my computer right now, and maybe I'll link to the site so you can look at it yourself. But I'm not going to go into that right now. I just thought you might be curious of what type of, how many hours you might have to do, or you will have to do. Medical oversight. Been hinting at it, and here we are. Your medical director is a fascinating thing, really. They have probably the most, of course they have the most authority, but I'm trying to articulate what that means. I was a director, and in order to maintain standards of both performance and behavior, I had authority. I was the top EMS officer. But I had to follow my county's personnel procedures. Now, I'm trying not to editorialize here, but I found that to be, when you're talking, personnel policies are personnel policies, and counties have a lot of different things they do. In other words, I had to hold my people to the same personnel policies that someone down in the Department of Sanitation, was. No more, no less. And I always thought that was a little bit ridiculous, and still do, because if somebody screws up with the recycling machine down at the dump, nobody dies. If a paramedic screws up, somebody could. That's neither here nor there. I just wanted to show you the limits of my authority. I could do some things very quickly. Most things took a lot of time and could be very frustrating to get done. Whether it was a good thing or a bad thing, I had to go through these channels. Medical directors In most cases, they're free from that. If a medical director tells you you're not functioning in my system, well, guess what? Now, it gets kind of muddy here because you are entitled to due process. You are entitled to due process. But I have never, in over 3 decades, seen the state of North Carolina go against a medical director, ever. Their word pretty much is law. Whether that's right or not, you can, ponder that yourself. I'm just telling you that it is. Your medical director is a very, very powerful individual. And they're powerful because they have a lot of responsibility. Not that the EMS director didn't, but they had a lot of responsibility. They are responsible for, at least in theory, and I have my reasons for saying in theory. I'll tell you why. I have never seen a medical director have his or her credentials placed in jeopardy because of what EMS personnel in their system did. Never. I've seen a lot of EMS people get in trouble, but I've never seen them go after a medical director for it. But if you read your text and if you read what the state says, theoretically, the medical director is responsible. They're responsible for direct medical oversight, as it says in the slide. That can take a lot of forms. I know in some large, at least one that I know of, I guess it's still going on, was Houston, I think. The medical director was a full-time employee of the EMS system. So you had a doctor on the staff, had his own vehicle, and he would actually go out and run calls. It doesn't get much more direct than that. But most of the time what that means is they do the same thing. The QA process routes the calls up the chain of command. You don't trouble your medical director with every single call because it's just not worth it. Usually it's the very good and the very bad. Same thing I used to hear about as a director, the very good and the very bad. Care is reviewed. Sometimes the medical director will actually schedule a meeting where they can meet directly with the medics and discuss what happened. Indirect medical oversight, this comes in the form of really in protocols that are approved by the medical director, procedures sometimes, the way the medical director wants things done. On and offline medical direction. Online medical direction, and I always think of the direct calling for orders, and you're not always going to talk to your medical director. You're not. You call into a hospital to receive a little bit of help from a doc there. You may talk to your medical director, but you're probably not. You're going to talk to a physician. And I've already mentioned standing orders. A lot of times medical directors will be involved in the creation of standing orders. We could pick at the bones of these all day long. Suffice it to say that the medical director has a great deal of influence on what goes on within his or her system. I've been very fortunate to work with some really great medical directors, honestly. Just fantastic. Very involved in EMS, very interested in EMS. One of the great things about the medical directors I've worked with is that they would actually come to Con Ed and actually teach classes occasionally. They couldn't do it a lot. I've never met a practicing physician. I've met some retired physicians that aren't busy, but I've never met a practicing physician that wasn't a very, very busy person. They put in a lot of hours. They make money, and I don't begrudge them that because it takes a long time to become a doctor, and you usually have to work very, very hard before you actually start seeing the fruits of that. But when you get a medical director that's willing to come in and teach paramedics, that's a fantastic thing. And their lectures, especially the last ones I went to were Dr. Carnegie down in Duplin. They were fantastic. It was the kind of lecture I could sit there and listen all day long because they were fascinating and they were very, very good. Let's see, primary charge of medical direction and developing, establishing guidelines under which the emergency medical service function. And that's pretty much it. From the state's perspective, medically speaking, not operationally speaking, but medically speaking, the medical director is that system. I mean, that's, if something goes wrong in that system medically, it's the medical director that they're going to have involved in the investigation or the look at that. If it's operational, it's usually the EMS director, but the medical director can be involved in that too. Some medical directors are much more involved in operations than others. Most of them content themselves, in my experience, I should say, content themselves with the medical aspects of the job. They don't get into the operational aspects of the job. Dr. Carnegie didn't, but he was such a source of great advice that I often talked things over with him. He was just a very, very experienced, intelligent man. So I did talk a lot of those decisions over with him, but he didn't get involved in those too much. Quality improvement, or QI. And your slide talks about it as a system of internal and external reviews and audits of all aspects of emergency medical system. There's a lot of ways you can affect. The smart thing for me as an instructor to do is simply lay this before you. We audit your calls, and that's quality assurance. But there's a great philosophical discussion on what quality assurance is in reality. What does it mean, quality assurance? We kind of got in the habit of reviewing charts and things of that nature, and it's a good thing to do. I'm not saying we shouldn't, but if we really want to get down to what what it really means to improve, there's a lot of other ways you can do it. Debriefings. Anytime that there's a high acuity call, have a debriefing. These are very effective, but they're also very hard to get a buy-in from with the crew because they are suspicious. They think that it's a secret way of saying they did something wrong or finding something they did wrong, when in actuality it may be just the opposite. It's simply we had a very complicated call. Everyone that we can get together who was involved in it, get them together, talk about it, talk about what went right, talk about what went wrong, so you can find ways to improve. If I prefer this, I like this. They're great learning experiences, and they're a great way of facilitating communication between all the members of the treatment team. But continuous quality assurance or quality improvement, I can tell you that the last few services I've worked for, 100% of all paperwork is audited. Everything you do, no matter how minor, is looked at. It's after the fact. It's after the fact. It's very hard to do quality assurance in real time. Simply an illustration of how the EMT fits into the QI or QA, whichever one you want to use, picture. Your document, I'm going to beat you over the head with this in medical legal, but I'll say this now. Your documentation, if you can be a fantastic provider and a consummate professional, if your documents are crappy, you're going to struggle. You're going to get questioned a whole lot. There is an old axiom, I should say, in EMS: is not documented, not done. That's about 80% true. There's a whole lot of things that go on in the call we don't routinely document. I don't document that I got out of the truck, but you can reasonably infer that I did, even though I don't document it. So you can take that to a ridiculous level, but you need to document well. It needs to look like it came from a medical professional. If it looks like it's got spelling errors and grammar errors and everything else in it, it reflects badly on you, and it casts doubt on your competence. A lot of the preventive maintenance, unfortunately, and I say unfortunately for a reason that we'll talk about in the next unit, preventive maintenance is largely on you. You've got to learn to take care of yourself, not only your personal and psychological well-being, but your medical skills. Yes, we have Con Ed. We talked a lot about Con Ed just a few slides back, but Con Ed's a checkbox. It's not to say it's not a good thing. It's not to say that it's not necessary, but only I know what I need to review. Really, only I know the things that I'm weak at, and I have to take it upon myself to try to strengthen myself in those areas. So a lot of that's on you. That's part of being a professional. And also you can file it under regular skill maintenance, which is also on this slide. Feedback from other professionals, that can be very useful. I promise you, screw up bad enough, you'll get feedback. You won't like it, but you'll get it. And then, of course, continuing education goes without saying. So there's things you have to do, and you're a part of quality assurance. One of the best things you can do for quality assurance is make sure the quality of the care you're rendering is top-notch, and continue to work at that. Issues in patient safety, and in the course of this discussion, I've kind of hinted at some of those. I mentioned it in the case study and a few other things, some of these. But there are certain things that are inherently high risk to a patient, sometimes to a provider. And we have a list of some of them here. Transfer of care from one provider to another. This is a particular problem because I have to pass on not only the patient, but I have to pass on everything I found, everything I've done. If we're not, me as the person passing it off and the person who's receiving this patient, if they're not listening, or if I don't give a complete report, then something vital can be left out, which disrupts the continuity of care for this patient. And it can be a very serious disruption. You know, the devil's in the details. A lot of times those details mean everything. Maybe a detail didn't mean anything to me. It's going to mean something to someone at the hospital, the doctor, or one of the nurses. It's very important that you pass on all the relevant information, and it's a risk point. It's a risk point. And it kind of falls into the next one: communications with other providers. There's other risk involved in that too, some of which delve into privacy, which again we'll talk about in medical legal. But it's risky. It's risky to talk about your patients. Even you don't, as a rule, don't talk about your patient. And frankly, it's a rule that's frequently violated. But on one hand, the other hand, we never talk about names. Half the time, we don't remember the names. Frankly, that's bad to say, but it's true. A lot of times, I don't remember the names of the patient, and don't ask if someone's telling me about a patient. It's a patient, and we're talking about an unusual situation with a patient, something that we had to deal with. At this stage in your education, you may, oh, that's cold. No, it's not cold. I won't go in the next chapter. We'll go into, yeah, you'll remember a lot of things you wish you didn't remember. The name is not that much a piece of information that I need. It's not something that sticks with me. I can tell you the vital signs of some patients I had in 1987. They stuck with me. The particular circumstances stuck with me, but I couldn't tell you their names. I can tell you what they look like. Their faces will stay with me for the rest of my life. But you need to be very careful discussing your cases, and that's a little spoiler for medical legal. We'll get back to it later. Carrying and moving patients is a danger to the patient and it's a danger to you. As I said before, they don't come with handles. And it's really easy to get yourself injured, and it's really easy if you don't think through your move, if you don't make sure that you are acting deliberately and carefully, then you can harm a patient. Particularly, well, I don't say particularly, it popped into my head, I think elderly people who are fragile and frail anyway, and if you manhandle them, you can actually cause a worse injury than the one they had, or an ancillary injury that they don't need. I mentioned this earlier in this chapter that I'd never do it, but if someone put a gun to my head and forced me to pick a category of things that can happen in this business that would result in you getting hurt or killed, it would be ambulance operations by far. It is the largest source of fatalities in our business. Ambulance operations is a responsibility. You do have a lot of authority. You're granted a lot of privileges in the name of operating in an emergency situation, but you have a huge responsibility. You can not only kill yourself, but your partner, your patient, and several other people on the highway. So enough said about that, I guess. Spinal motion restriction decisions, this used to be very easy. We looked at the mechanism of injury. If it looked like there was even a possibility, no matter how remote, that this patient had a spinal problem, we boarded them up. Well, we've moved now into an era where we're clearing C-spines in the field under protocol. There are protocols in place, things you look for, things you have to check off your little list before you can do that. But if you blow that call and someone does have a spinal injury, your life's about to get very interesting. I talked a little bit about errors, mistakes, and as I was editing that part of this, I was like, maybe I should go and clarify that further. I said that if you make a mistake, it's usually a teachable moment. And I stand by that. It usually doesn't result in a fatality. It usually doesn't result in serious harm. But you need to be very aware that it can result in serious harm. When they happen, we've got three little bullets on this list. It can happen for a lot of reasons. I don't want to give you a false sense of security, but there's a lot more than 3 reasons that it can happen. This usually results from improper skill performance, not following the rules, and lack of knowledge. Actually, I don't have any argument with any of those. I just think there should be a few more on there. When I talk medical legal, and I've done lectures on medical legal, I'm not a lawyer, but I've studied it. It's a fascinating subject to me. I'm always reading this case or the other case or some case involving EMS because I find it fascinating. I find it fascinating how much we don't know about the legal environment in which we function. But I get asked, in a word or in a short phrase, what's the best way to avoid how to avoid an negligent suit? I'm going to tell you what it is. Know your job and do it well every single time. That's your best defense right there. And I can throw in and document the heck out of the fact you did it. But many, many times when we run afoul of things or we have a bad outcome with the patients, not because, sometimes you can do everything right and the patient still not make it. That's life. And that's just the nature of life. People don't always make it despite our best efforts. The best efforts of anyone, doctors, nurses, us, everything, people don't make it. But if you go outside of your scope of practice, either you underperform, you overperform, you're gonna have an issue. Sooner or later, you're gonna have an issue. Those things weren't what I was talking about when I said you made a mistake. I'm not going to go down a list of mistakes you could possibly make. During the course of this program, you'll hear them, but I'm not going to go over them now. Talk a little about EMS research. In North Carolina, and I'm saying North Carolina because it's the only state of which I have firsthand knowledge, really, we've always done, in a broad sense, some type of research, even if it was just collecting rudimentary data and publishing number of a specific type of call, response time data, things like that. But in the last 15 years or so, we've really got serious about data collection. We've got serious about research. evidence-based practices really made a surge, and I'm a big fan of that. There's a whole lot of things we did. You're going to hear about something in this program. I'm probably going to hear about it. I haven't looked far enough ahead to know, but it might even be in your textbook. It's been taught, and it's been in a lot of textbooks. The concept, something called the golden hour. The golden hour is the first 60 minutes following a traumatic event. Supposedly, it's a target for us that if we can get them to a trauma center in that length of time, their survivability chances improve. It may surprise you to know there's not one scintilla of evidence, medically speaking, to support that, and it's been taught for 30 years that I know of. There's nothing to back that up. There's not one definitive study that says, oh yeah, 60 minutes and then bad things happen after that. Is it a good standard? Of course. It stands to reason that the quicker we can get them to a trauma center, the better off they're going to be. And I'm sure that could be backed up with some type of statistical data. But the golden hour, as it's been taught, is a myth. It has nothing to back it up. We've moved away from things like that. We've moved into evidence-based practices. You heard that in the course of this discussion, and you're going to hear it over and over and over again. And the way we get our evidence is by research. The rest of the medical community, who had a big jump on us, really, have been doing it forever. But now we're doing it. We're looking at evidence, and we're seeing what works and what doesn't, and that's guiding our practice. That's guiding what we do. Unfortunately, it takes a long, long time for an evidence-based practice to take hold. A lot of times the research is way ahead of the actual protocols and procedures. That sometimes takes forever. There's reasons for that are way beyond the scope of this discussion, but we are at least using research now to guide our decisions. We're going to talk about 4 steps in evidence-based decision making. It's really the 4 steps when you do research. If you go on from here and you continue your education, particularly in college, particularly in grad school, you're going to be asked to formulate a question that needs to be answered. You're going to look at something. And what do I want to know about this something? This is the question that needs to be answered. And then you're going to do, and you'll get really good at it, because you're going to write a lot of papers, searching the literature for the applicable data that either supports or detracts from your hypothesis. You're going to look for that. This is the step 3, that a lot of times gets murky, muddy, or people get lazy and don't do. And it is appraise the data for validity and reliability. The devil's in the details, ladies and gentlemen. I look at a lot of studies. I look at a lot of research projects that have been published, and then I go into the methodology, and I go into the sample size and who was sampled and how it was sampled. And a lot of times, if you do that, well, let's just say you have a better idea of how serious you should take this work. A lot of people, it drives me crazy, and we're in a time in this country, in the world, where if you don't like facts, you can just make up alternate facts. And you can always find data to support it. And as long as nobody looks very closely at that data, you're okay. But I see a lot of things on the news, particularly, where studies show blah, blah, blah. And then I pull up the actual study, and I look at the internals. I look at the how it was done, who did it. And I find that, I don't support your conclusions, because I find your methods dubious and how you did it dubious. But number 4, if the evidence supports a change in practice, change protocols and implement the change in pre-hospital emergency care. All of those were related to what we do, but it's not. It's actually related to anything that you're researching, whether it's EMS practice or anything else. You can use these steps to do it. And this is what we do. And I mentioned number 3, and a special warning about number 3 when you're looking at this. This happens to us too. This happens to us. Somebody will put me. I've seen one of the big topics has been ever since I've been in EMS is the skill of endotracheal intubation, and I have seen studies that say we shouldn't do it. I've seen studies that say we should, and they're all using this particular formula, but they're all coming to different conclusions. So, again, you have to go back and look at one of the last ones I read, but that's the last one that I read against us doing the skill was, I'm not going to mention it. I remember it, but I'm not going to mention it. It was a joke. It was a total hit piece. And when you went into the internals and looked at the data and how they collected it and everything else, using their own data, then I could have put forth the argument that nobody needed to be intubated, because it was the most simple. It was endotracheal intubations in the field, their correlation with return of spontaneous circulation. And it's a terrible criteria to use. Terrible criteria to use, because by that criteria, I could plainly see that you get about the same results by people in the hospital, doctors who did it. There's an unfortunate little axiom that you need to learn, and that is dead people have an annoying tendency to stay dead. So if you went by that criteria, then the IV did no good either. Whatever. You could go on and on. If you use the fact that they did not return from the dead as a criteria for doing or not doing something, I thought that was just interesting to me anyway. But it makes the point. The devil's in the details. Do not believe everything you read, everything you hear, just because it may have came from an academic study. I've often said, I used to joke with my professors that let me cherry pick my sources and I can prove to you the world is flat. As long as you don't look too close at the data, it's going to look very official and very, very academic, but it may not necessarily be true. Kind of mentioned this already. Research does not exist to support many practices in EMS. I just mentioned one, the golden hour. There was nothing to support that. Interesting story how that came to be. I'll tell it some other time, but we've been using it for years. It's still taught. You'll still see it in many EMS articles, in many textbooks, and it's a complete myth. That's a complete myth. In the early days of EMS, we didn't have any research except hospital research, which is why we did so many things that don't, as the next bulletin says, research in hospital settings does not always transfer well to EMS settings. We didn't have anything else. So we adopted hospital stuff for our own use. Now we have our own data, and we're starting to see just where those things are that we've been doing that we adopted from somewhere else that don't work very well. If the opportunity arises, every EMT has an obligation to participate in research that contributes to the profession. And in a way you do, whether you know it or not. If you fill out a report in this state, you're contributing to research. But you may be asked. There's been some clinical studies, things like that have been done in the pre-hospital environment with different services out there. And you may and probably will at some point in your career be asked to contribute to research. Evidence-based guidelines use the same approach as evidence-based medicine and develop guidelines for medical practice. FICMS, NEMSAC facilitated development of the National Pre-Hospital Evidence-Based Guideline Model Process. If I can find this, I'll link to it so you can look this over. At this stage, I'm not really all that concerned with you formulating research projects. We're just getting started. You'll have plenty of time to do that, and you will need a working knowledge of this at some point if you do research. And I'll see if I can get a link to it. Very, very brief outline of this guideline. And it starts with input from national guidelines, evidence collected, evaluated, protocols developed and disseminated. Following implementation, the process is reviewed for effectiveness. So you don't just do something, set it and forget it, never come back to it. And that's the thing about, well, we're talking about medicine, emergency pre-hospital medicine in particular. But in academia, it's happening all the time. Everything is reevaluated, and that's the way it should be, I suppose. You need to look at things and see if there's a better way, or if maybe something we thought was just the greatest thing in the world turned out. And I can run off a list of things that we thought were the greatest thing in the world that turned out to be not all that great, and not to be, if not ineffective, not all that effective. Ben, we're back with Ben. Ben was seen in the emergency department and then admitted to the cardiac care unit of the hospital. Ben's cardiologist told Ben that he has several risk factors for heart problems, but that some of the risk factors can be changed. And that, as I remember from Ben's case, is very true. What are some public health efforts that help decrease the rate of illnesses like Ben's? There's a lot of them. And some of them I think have been very good. Some of them I think were a little bit of an overreach, at least from my perspective. As much as we want to, guys, we can't force people to be healthy. We can educate. We can, and that's what we do. I think that's one of the most effective things. We educate people about risks and about, and you as a medical professional have a limited role in that. You know, we're very told, and again in medical legal you hear more, we don't give, I want to make sure I put this correctly, we don't give medical advice as far as a regimen. That's a doctor's role. That's a doctor's role. But I don't have a bit of problem saying, hey, you shouldn't smoke, even though I smoke occasionally. I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem saying, you know, exercise is good for you. This is something that I'm very comfortable, and I'm not, because it's universally true. I'm not going and telling someone, well, you need to take vitamin E and an aspirin regimen and blah blah blah. No, you're getting in. It may be true. I may know it to be true, but you're getting into sketchy territory when you're giving medical advice like that. That is really for the patient's physician to do. That doesn't mean if somebody asks me a question, I won't try to answer it. But I always qualify that answer with, but a doctor would be the best one for you to talk to this about. I'll tell you what I know about it. Understand, I'm not a physician. You need to talk to a physician about it. Do that a lot. People find out you're in the medical field at all, you become everybody's doctor if you let them. I get calls about cold medicine and everything else, and I don't mind answering, but and I'm also reasonably sure that when family does that, they're not going to sue me. But if it's somebody else, I'm going to be very careful how I answer that. And be careful, Rob, you're getting into medical legal. What role, I just told you, what role could EMS providers take in public health efforts? Public health's come a long way, and I'm happy about that. I do think some of the things we've attempted to do, especially at the federal level, for health reasons were way, way, way out of line. Like, feeding growing kids lettuce and expecting them to like it and couldn't understand why their lunches were being thrown away. It's because you tried to force upon a bunch of kids stuff they're not going to eat. So they wouldn't eat it all, or they were throwing it away, and we wasted a lot of food. Well, we live and we learn. EMTs are part of the public health team. We have reporting duties sometimes. Right now, I'm not in the field at the moment. I came off the truck just as COVID was hitting. I imagine, it had not happened yet, but I imagine that our calls were being monitored very closely for the possibility of COVID when it was starting to spread. The health department tracks those things. Back during Ebola, I had instructed our people, if you suspect this, it needs to be reported immediately because we're trying to stem the spread of it. The last bullet on this particular slide, EMTs play a role in identifying public health problems and in attempts to reduce injury and illness and promote public health. Yes, we do. We can do that, and we should do that. Like I say, I'm very careful about how I do that, because I don't want to overstep my bounds. I don't mind giving advice that the dirty little secret is they probably already know. They're overweight, need to lose weight. They know that. I can tell them if they ask me. I'm not going to go out of my way to do it, but because I don't want to be rude. But if they ask me if they want to talk about their high blood pressure and they're asking me about things they can do, yes, I'll tell them. And I'll also very quickly say, but you really need to sit down with your physician and have a serious talk about this and let them advise you. Very quickly, let's go over the 10 greatest public health achievements in the United States 20th century. Vaccinations, absolutely. No doubt that we've staved off a lot of deaths through vaccinations. Motor vehicle safety, that's come a long way. Workplace safety, control of infectious diseases, reduction in deaths from coronary heart disease and stroke. That's a big one. That is still probably the most visible thing that public health has done. Safer and more healthful foods, decline in maternal and infant mortality, use of barrier devices during sex. Let it go. Fluoridation of drinking water, reduction in the use of tobacco products. So, public health has done a lot of good things. There's no doubt about that. And we do have a role in it. Nice picture. What you see here is a CPR class. And this is where we do a lot of our public education. We teach CPR classes, first aid classes. We do child seat inspections. A lot of fire departments do that. Some EMS places do that. We do blood pressure checks. We do little things like that. This is where we do our public education. Your agency set these things up, and you go out and participate in them. Most of the time, to be honest with you, they're a lot of fun. I enjoy doing them, talking to people, and just in an environment where everybody's not got their hair on fire, and we can actually talk with people and have the luxury of being able to do that. As I mentioned, we'll move through these relatively quickly. Really enjoy the kids, that come and crawl over our truck and everything else. Make sure your truck's out of service if you can when you do that, because believe me, that's when your call is going to drop, when you've got 15 kids crawling all over your ambulance. They're a lot of fun, though. It's a lot of fun to show them things, and they're usually very interested. Okay. One of the hot topics in EMS these days is integrated healthcare and community paramedicine. I'm starting to see this, particularly mobile integrated healthcare. I'm starting to see it pop up. I'm seeing it on the side of ambulances and things like that. Basically what it is, and it's just what the slide says, the integrated services provided by a variety of healthcare entities and practitioners into EMS. There's a lot of ways to do this, and that would be a lecture in and of itself, so we'll just leave it at that for right now. Community paramedicine, services provided by the EMS agency and its EMS personnel. This has been, it's been out there for a while, and some places actually have set up community paramedicine programs. And I think it's a great thing. I really do. I have some reservations, and probably it's because of my management side of my brain working, in that while NCOMS recognizes it, there's no curriculum for it. There's no, at this point in time, this has always been my problem. I mentioned back when I first talked about this at the beginning of this presentation, that there were some things standing in the way of it taking off. And one of the things, whether you like it or not, that management has to do is manage risk. And I would love to have an accredited curriculum to train my people by before I send them out to do this. Now, I know people, I can argue both sides of this. I know people who've set these things up. I know medics who've done it, and they'll tell you that the liability is very, very slim. There's not a lot of it, but I'm sorry. I believe there's liability in everything we do, right down to operating our vehicles. So I'd like to have something to fall back on that says this accredited group of people have put this curriculum together, and this is what community paramedicine is supposed to do, or at least the core skills of community paramedic. Also, another thing too, and a big obstacle is, again, you're going to get sick of hearing this, but it's a noble idea that you have to pay for. And this one is complicated. Community paramedicine is complicated by the fact that neither Medicare or Medicaid will reimburse these agencies for these community paramedics. So you're basically doing it for free. Now, there is work going on right now to get these services covered by Medicare and Medicaid, and when they do, I imagine you'll see these things take off. But right now, it's kind of been fits and, 2 steps forward and 1 step back with these programs because of both finances and because, you're trying to carve out a niche. We already have home health. You don't want to duplicate services. That's ridiculous. And that's one of the bad things that everybody says about government is we got, all these agencies that overlap. So you want it to be a unique niche. And mostly what it is like, in some cases, in one agency I know, it's designed really to keep regulars from being regulars. Instead of waiting for them to call us 6 times a week, the community medic goes out there and checks on them and checks their blood sugar, makes sure they're taking their medication, things of that nature. Sometimes they do follow-up wound care. They'll go out at post-surgery and they'll check on a wound, make sure they're not getting infected, this, that, and the other. But that's one of the things about community paramedicine that has made it kind of nebulous. It's because every community paramedic has a little bit of a unique twist on what they're doing. Where they're kind of different. They're kind of, I hate to say it, and I may be wrong in saying it, but it's almost like we're making this up as we go. And that's great. Sometimes great things happen that way. Sometimes disasters happen that way. And if I'm the one that has to answer for the disaster, I'm going to be a little bit cautious before I just, first of all, ask for a lot of additional funding to set this program up that I'm not, I'm going to have to tell my powers that be that we're not going to get reimbursed for this. And so that's going to be a hard sell to begin with in rural services. Some of the metro services, and I'll go ahead and tell you, I don't want to leave you hanging thinking this is a bad thing. Hospitals have a vested interest in keeping these patients out as well. You don't want, if you're a hospital, you don't want a patient coming back for the same thing within a certain time frame. I think it's 30 days. That affects your reimbursement from Medicare and Medicaid. So some of these places have worked out, some EMS agencies have worked out arrangements with the hospitals that the hospitals pay the EMS system out of the savings of keeping these repeat patients from coming back. I know of one agency where that's pretty much the case, where it was a good deal for the hospital because they were losing reimbursement or risk losing reimbursement over returning patients for the same thing. So psych patients that are being routed into the ER and costing them a lot of money they're never going to pay. The EMS system actually helps route them to the psych facilities. And with the money that the hospitals save, they reimburse the EMS system. So there are ways of making it work. It's just, if you're a rural area and you don't have that much traffic, that much of a census as far as patients goes, I don't know that a hospital would find it in their interest to do that in rural areas. So you're back to looking at being funded by taxpayers. Hard sell, not impossible. And as I say, as this develops, you're going to see more and more of it. This is the next step, really, one of them, expanded scope of practice. And that's where this came from. For a long time, the community medicine concept was an offshoot of the expanded scope of practice for paramedics. And we'll have to wait and see how this all plays out. Integrated health services may include services such as increasing access to underserved areas, providing advice to 911 callers via phone rather than dispatching resources. Danger, Will Robinson. Use of specially trained EMS providers to help individuals manage chronic diseases and follow-up care. A lot of the things I just told you about community paramedicine are also the mobile integrated healthcare. And this may, in fact, be that niche that I was saying that in some communities that the community paramedicine can fill that's underrepresented by other agencies. EMS can do it if they have the resources to do it and they're willing to do it. Oh, goodness. After giving a report to the emergency department and the ED about Ben's condition and pre-hospital treatment, Alexis compliments Peter and Julia on their assessment and care. Peter takes the opportunity to ask Alexis a few questions about patients who present as Ben did, and really, I've always thought that Peter had a thing for Alexis anyway, so I think he was probably just making small talk, but for the case study, we'll say he did. And Alexis gives him that feedback. And I think that, just to wrap this up, that Peter and Alexis should be married and live happily ever after in this story. And I'm going to add that if they don't. Ben was discharged from hospital with a cardiac pacemaker to keep his heart beating at the right rate. He participates in a cardiac rehabilitation program and is working with a nutritionist on his diet. He still frequents Dave's, but more often than not, he opts for a bowl of oatmeal with fruit, meaning that he just wishes he was dead. Actually, I like fruit. I don't like oatmeal, but also I like fried chicken, and I like other good things that Dave's probably serves, so it's very hard. But then again, almost dying will get your attention. Believe me, it'll focus your attention. You'll be amazed at how you can change your whole outlook when you come close to death. I'm going to do the lesson summary, and I'm going to bring this to a close. The shape of modern EMS system has been influenced many years by the events throughout history. Yes, it has, no doubt. They say there are two ways that things happen, by evolution and revolution. EMS has aspects of both. It was the natural evolution of battlefield techniques that were incorporated in civilian life, and then some of the things were truly revolutionary, taking non-doctors and teaching them doctor skills and putting them on the street for immediate care. That was truly revolutionary. And believe me, if you read I don't know if I had done the history, you would. Dr. Eugene Nagel, who set it up in Miami, the first, usually regarded as the first paramedic services, had a lot of resistance, and it got very heated. I actually was fortunate enough to talk to one of the paramedics from that first class, and he told me about that. It was heated. There was a lot of resistance to what he was trying to do, and yet he saw it through. Eugene Nagel, if you haven't heard or you will, is usually considered the father of paramedicine. He's our George Washington. But to be honest with you, there were a few others that probably made great contributions as well. I've got no problem with Eugene Nagel being considered the father. I just have read of some other accomplishments of other people that the accomplishments of other people that I think are just as impressive. EMS Systems must address 10 specific areas. We went over all of them. 911 is the access number for EMS in the United States. There are 4 nationally recognized levels of EMS providers in the United States. We went over those. EMTs have specific responsibilities. Medical direction and QI are essential components of the EMS system. And EMS practices change over time based on research findings. EMS is part of the public health system and can make an impact to the public health community. And mobile and integrated health care and community paramedicine will continue to evolve and shape EMS. I hope that I have expounded on each of these sufficiently, and I'm going to bring this particular lesson to an end of EMS Systems. We're going to be operating amongst the template that we've laid out here for the rest of this program. Everything that we do is in this framework of an EMS system. So I think these concepts will be reinforced as we go on, as well as hopefully reinforced now, but they'll be reinforced again as we go on. So remember, if you had questions about anything that we talked about, write them down, bring them to me in lab, or email them to me if you don't want to wait. I'll try to get to them. I'll have my mailbag set up here. You can send me something if you'd like, and we'll do this again when we tackle wellness and other issues in Chapter 2. Have a great day, gang.